everybody, this is Eve Ewing. I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lecture Series. And before we get started with our amazing talk this week, there are two things I want to remind you to do. The first thing is, if you are not already signed up for our newsletter, you definitely want to do that. It's how you're going to find out about all of our incredible speakers and enter a raffle to win books and find out about questions and readings and all the cool stuff. So go to our website, blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter, and sign up if you haven't done that already. The second thing is, we would really love this to be a collective learning experience. So if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to get together with a squad, a group of friends, or just one friend. Hook up with somebody and say, hey, I'm watching this thing, I'm reading this stuff, and I would love to have some conversations with you about it. Get together so that this is not a thing we're doing alone. That's it. Welcome. Really geeked to have you, and let's get into it.
Hello, I'm Dr. Alaina E, and I have been graciously invited today to speak to you about Black and Indigenous solidarities. But to do that, we must also talk about the antagonisms between Black and Indigenous people, the anti-Blackness present in Native communities, and the anti-Native sentiment that historically has been a part of Black migration and settlement in North America. As the pre-reading for this talk, I selected a Buzzfeed article on the Black members of the Seminole Indian Nation who are being denied COVID-19 vaccines by their own fellow tribespeople. This is a life or death situation that really brings home the stakes of anti-Blackness in Native American communities. But for many of you, the portion of the African diaspora that was enslaved and freed by Native Americans is an unfamiliar topic. So today I'm going to give you some background to help you better understand that article and the broader historical context between and behind Black people who are today a part of Native American nations. And then I'm going to leave you with some questions that will hopefully bring us back around to this question of multiracial coalition between these two communities who share so much in common. So we all know that African chattel slavery was introduced to the Americas by Europeans. So how did some Native Americans come to start owning Black people as slaves? After the United States' birth as a country, the government used various tactics to deal with Native people, including war and treaties. In the late 1700s, white American politicians and reformers began encouraging Native Americans, particularly those in the Southeast and East, to adapt aspects of Euro-American culture, such as language, clothing, political structures, etc., arguing that this would civilize them, aka make them more like white people. As chattel slavery became increasingly integral to white society, white Americans also encouraged Native people to become slaveholders. And there were 5 Indian southeastern tribes who decided to adapt these things. They started to send their children to be educated in American schools. They created their own newspapers. They created a tripartite government system, so a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, just like the United States. And many of the most influential members of these tribes also decided to purchase enslaved Black people. These 5 tribes were the Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, and Choctaws, and historians usually refer to these 5 tribes as the 5 tribes. So these nations saw these changes as ones that would help them strategically with the United States. Approximating whiteness while still remaining attached to their tribal identities allowed them better treatment relative to other Native people. The 5 tribes began to change their laws to include slavery, and soon they had really all the same sorts of laws that we think about in the United States South. So slave owners could punish their slaves harshly. Enslaved people were not allowed to learn to read or write. They could not meet for a religious gathering unless given permission, and so on. But approximating whiteness only got the 5 tribes so far. When white plantation owners began eyeing native lands in rich, fertile places like Mississippi and Georgia, it didn't matter that the 5 tribes were supposedly more civilized than other Indians. They weren't white. And so Americans squatted on their lands, and the states of Georgia and Mississippi and others refused to honor these native nations' claims to their land. In 1828, the Cherokee Nation took their cause to the Supreme Court, arguing that they were sovereign nations whose treaties with the United States acknowledged their claims and status. Meanwhile, members of the U.S. Congress moved against Native people, and at the urging of President Andrew Jackson, they passed the Indian Removal Act, which of course provided for the forced removal of the 5 tribes, as well as many other Native people from their homelands. Now, what does this have to do with Black people? Well, As the five tribes made this horrific journey where they faced extreme cold, extreme heat, as well as malnourishment, sickness, I could go on, they walked side by side with the Black people they owned as slaves. These people helped them along their journey, performing different tasks for them. And so for the five tribes, Indian removal, or what you may know as the Trail of Tears, was an important part of both Native American and Black history. And as they left their homes, white slave owners moved in. And so Indian removal allowed for the expansion of plantation slavery that gives us the cotton boom of the antebellum period. So this is really an important connection between Black and Native history that I don't think is emphasized enough. So once they were in their new home, called Indian Territory, which is today part of modern-day Oklahoma, the five tribes and the Black people in their nations rebuilt their homes, plantations, and government buildings, many of which you can still see today. But only 30 years later, they had to again deal with the intrusion of the United States. In the US, discord over the institution of slavery was brewing, as abolitionists gained a foothold in popular culture, and various states voted on allowing it within its borders. As Southern states seceded, the Confederacy approached the five tribes, speaking to their shared desire to maintain slavery and keep federal jurisdiction out of their borders. In some nations, like the Cherokee and Creek nations, there were actually large factional disputes over the institution of slavery, somewhat similar to like we see in the US. Confederates told the five tribes that they would treat them better than the United States did. And so you actually have a battle between the Confederacy and the Union over Native American loyalty. So the Confederates say, we're going to give you congressional representation. We're going to give you a more influential say in governmental affairs. We're going to allow you to keep your land in Indian territory forever without white settlement. And so these are the things that they're really kind of picking up on as things that the five tribes aren't happy about with the United States. Now, would the Confederacy have actually kept these promises? Probably not. After all, the Confederacy was primarily composed of the states that had forced the five tribes to move in the first place, these southern states who really wanted them out. But their entreaties were enticing to the five tribes, especially for people who wanted to maintain slavery. And so these five tribes split over the war, with some members of these tribes fighting for the Union and some members of these tribes fighting for the Confederacy. And this is important because of what comes immediately after the Civil War. So when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that some tribal members had fought for the Union, and they ignore the fact that they had actually not sent any kind of military support to the five tribes. Instead, they use the fact that some members of the five tribes fought for the Confederacy against them. So they point to this alliance with the Confederacy as behavior that was deserving of punishment, and they claim that they were going to stop all of their former treaties made with the five tribes unless they created a new treaty. And so they're withholding things from them like monies that are very necessary in this post-war period to rebuild. And they do this until the five tribes agree to new treaties, which we know as the Treaties of 1866, because this is when they are ratified. And so these treaties serve as the five tribes' official surrender from the war, but also as their reconstruction documents. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So one of the most extreme items in these treaties is the cession of land. And so the five tribes have, come from the southeast on the Trail of Tears, moved to this new place. All this land is supposed to be theirs. Now, only about 30 years later, they are giving it up again to the United States, some of this land. But the other important items in these treaties are related to Black people. And so the United States has the five tribes emancipate the enslaved people in their nations, adopt them as citizens, and give them land. And the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nation specifically had to give their former slaves 40 acres of land. Now, most of you know the significance of 40 acres. This is what African Americans in the United States fought for and did not receive. This is a number, a phrase, still used in the Black community to talk about reparations and how the American government failed African Americans. But these are Black people who actually received it. Now, this is the United States coming into five other nations, Indian nations that are supposed to be sovereign in any other way. They're supposed to be able to decide their tribal membership. They're supposed to be able to make their own laws, almost everything that any other sovereign nation would be able to do. And the United States is telling them, you have to make these changes because we say so. Now, is this legally right? No. Well, Black people were actually being used in a way as a tool to weaken Native nations' right to make their own decisions about tribal membership and governance. The Cherokee Nation had ordered emancipation in 1863, along with the U.S. with the Emancipation Proclamation. And so they were the only one of the 5 tribes to actually emancipate without direct coercion. But without U.S. intervention, we don't know if the other tribes would have ever emancipated their slaves. We don't know if they ever would have given them rights. But we probably know they would not have given them land. And so these freedoms, these rights, and especially this land, put the former slaves of the 5 tribes on a different plane than African Americans in the United States. It gave them different opportunities. And these opportunities are why so many Black people from the United States flocked to Indian Territory after emancipation. This Black migration is why Oklahoma Black towns exist, and it's why Black Wall Street existed. Now, I know many people just learned about the Tulsa Massacre thanks to Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, but these shows and even a lot of the articles that follow them trying to kind of explain this event miss this deeper history of the region. African Americans came from the South to Indian Territory and later to Oklahoma because the United States had forced Indian nations to recognize Black rights and to give them a sort of reparations. They had forced Indian nations to do something that they themselves were unwilling to do. And so we can only truly understand the Tulsa Massacre if we know about and understand the Black and Native people who lived in Tulsa and the broader region before. Now, what I argue in my new book is that even though life in Indian Territory was not perfect for Black people, there was no large-scale white violence, and there was no large-scale attack on their right to vote, for example. And so Black people are serving on juries and voting and building homes and communities in Indian Territory through the 1890s, while African Americans in the South have seen their ability to exercise their rights and live freely really decimated by this point. At the same time, as they moved, these Black migrants sometimes brought with them negative and harmful ideas about Native Americans. And these are ideas that they've taken from whites. For example, many African American leaders, including Frederick Douglass, spoke about how Native Americans were uncivilized. And so he argued that Black settlement in places like Indian Territory would improve the West. Now, this, in effect, was promoting colonization. This was not living in kind with Indian brothers and sisters. This was not advocating for a multiracial democracy, but rather this was disparaging Native people, to argue that Native Americans were not the ideal residents of the West, but instead African Americans were, because they were more willing to assimilate to white American culture. And so Black settlement in Indian Territory is more complicated than the celebratory narrative of, say, Black Wall Street. Some Black people bought into and disseminated racially prejudiced ideas about Native people. And some Native people adopted chattel slavery and anti-Blackness. Now, of course, one of these is worse than the other, but these were 2 groups, Native people and Black people, who were both trying to survive, both trying to win at an unwinnable game of succeeding in a white supremacist society. When Oklahoma became a state, both Black and Native people lost out. Under tribal jurisdiction, so under the jurisdiction of these Indian nations, Black and Native people had clearly delineated rights, their own courts, and the ability to govern themselves, more or less. After Oklahoma statehood, tribal jurisdiction changed to American jurisdiction, meaning tribes could no longer fully function as governments or enforce the rights of their citizens. The first law passed after Oklahoma statehood detailed the creation of segregated facilities. And life in Oklahoma soon really resembled the Jim Crow environment that Southern African Americans had previously lived in and fled. So how do we get from the early 20th century to today with the article that I asked you to read before this talk? Well, when we think about Black civil rights in this country, we think about the many battles that African Americans have fought legally, socially, and economically to really defend their rights as American citizens. But those people descended from Black women and men enslaved by the 5 tribes have had their own battles for civil rights. In the United States, the 14th and 15th Amendments allowed Black people citizenship and Black men the right to vote. Within the 5 tribes, the treaties of 1866 served really the same purpose. Similar to the way Southern states, not long after the passage of these amendments, began infringing on the rights guaranteed for Black people, throughout the late 20th century, the five tribes began to infringe on the rights of Black people in their nations, usually referred to as freedmen. In the 1970s and 1980s, all of these tribes eliminated freedmen's right to vote, or their citizenship entirely, through legislation or referendum. Now you might think it would be big news that a handful of Indian nations had blatantly discriminated against their own members, against their own citizens, because they were Black. Jim Crow segregation in the US South and South African apartheid all eventually faced judgment on the world stage thanks to the activism of Black people. But freedmen have been calling out, asking for attention to their plight for a long time, and no one really listened. Or their argument was that freedmen weren't Indian, so they should have never been members of these tribes in the first place, and that tribes should be able to decide their own qualifications for membership. That's tribal sovereignty. Now, many freedmen are racially Native American, but even if they weren't or aren't, these nations made a legal guarantee in a treaty to give them the rights of citizenship, the same rights as Indian members of their tribes. Just like the United States made a legal guarantee in the 14th Amendment that African Americans were American citizens. And yet, as you read, the five tribes, specifically the Seminoles in that article, refused to give life-saving COVID vaccines to Black tribal members because they allege that they are not citizens by blood or by ancestry. And this is only one example. In the Creek Nation, Black tribal members often don't have access to all the privileges of citizenship, such as tribal scholarships or food banks. In the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations, the nations in which my ancestors were enslaved, freedmen have no rights as citizens. Zero. Now, this is a clear violation of the treaties of 1866. And yet the five tribes have shown that they are unwilling to change unless they're taken to court. And even then they fight it. The five tribes want to be taken seriously as sovereign nations. But if they truly are, tribal citizenship is a political identity, not a racial identity. It doesn't matter if freedmen are Indian through their ancestry because they are Indian by treaty. So what do I want you to take from this? Last summer, when George Floyd was murdered and Black people across the country rose up to protest police violence, many Native American activists were at their sides. In 2016 and 2017, when Native American activists protested the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, many Black Lives Matter activists supported them. If we go even farther back, the Black Panthers and American Indian movement members worked together in various ways in the 1960s and the 1970s. There are moments when these two communities that have suffered so much from colonization come together. But how can we sustain this multiracial movement? My 2 cents as a historian is that we must first acknowledge the past. We must acknowledge the roots of anti-Blackness in Native communities and its current forms. How have Native communities, even outside of the five tribes, discriminated against Black people inside and outside their nations? We must acknowledge that the foundation beneath Black towns and Black life is Native land, and ask ourselves, how can we work to advocate for the Native people who still exist today? The work that I do and the issues I ask people to wrestle with are not always comfortable. Looking closer at the relationships between Black and Native people historically and today does not always mean finding happy stories about solidarity. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that we have to work harder to overcome the artificial walls that the settler state has built between us. Thank you.